So Netflix recently launched, and subsequently I just watched, the first of their Fear Street trilogy. A cool, new, and perhaps somewhat gimmicky movie event where they acquired the rights to R.L. Stine's teen-targeted book series of the same name, with the intent of releasing 3 consecutive films week to week. Each film telling the story of a different murderous occurrence, all separated in setting by decades, but connected by the narrative device of one town and the creepy curse that plagues it. With the first movie being the latest in the timeline, and each subsequent release going back further into the origins of how these grisly cycles of violence came to be. Now, I'd like to talk about this first film, but if you allow me a brief tangent before I get into the bulk of the review, I want to say that while I'm unfamiliar with the source material this is based on, I am familiar with R.L. Stine as a figure for adaptation, as I was a kid of the Goosebumps era. Or rather, at least I would have been if my parents could have afforded the Fox Kids channel where it was broadcast here in the UK. That said, despite the absence of the visual version of R.L. Stine's horror anthology in my life, I was very much aware of its existence. I'd see adverts telling me to watch it on this out-of-reach broadcaster all the time. On days I was lucky, I'd catch small glimpses of episodes at richer friends and relatives' houses, and every Christmas and birthday for about 3 years, I'd beg my mum for the One Day at Horrorland Parts 1 and 2 VHS. A request that was always denied because she didn't want me watching something so, and I quote, twisted. Which in hindsight is really weird considering my library card for the longest time was used almost exclusively to borrow every Goosebumps book they ever got in 4 at a time, and she was quite happy for me to absorb them quicker than Mr. Stine could publish them. I guess reading about Headless Ghost was deemed for some reason not as offensive as watching it play out in low budget campiness. Regardless of the reasons though, my lack of ability to physically watch Goosebumps as a young kid craving the kind of dark stories I just knew adults were watching only made them more enticing. It felt like I was excluded from an exclusive club somehow, some incredible dark secret only spoken about in hushed tones. Goosebumps was mysterious, Goosebumps was elusive, and above all else, Goosebumps was forbidden. Reading the stories in my hands and mentally imagining all of the graphic ways in which these words could be depicted, my imagination would run wild. Just how creepy could these occasionally grisly descriptions be if brought to life through the small screen? Was the show somehow darker than these books I loved so much, and is that why I wasn't allowed to watch them? Were they gory? Were they disturbing? Just what was so bad about them that the grown-up in my life felt the need to keep them out of reach of my tiny baby boy fingers? Now obviously as a big grown-up man who can watch Goosebumps all by himself now and not even be scared, now I can say that isn't the case. Watching Goosebumps now is an almost joyously comical experience. It's a kitsch bit of fun filled with week-to-week cheesy acting, cool creature costumes, and campy 90s TV effects. While it definitely holds a special place in my heart, it certainly wasn't what my mum had unintentionally built up in my head with the restrictions she had placed on it. The reason I bring this up, however, is because Netflix's Fear Street is the Goosebumps my overly paranoid parents' words had promised me. Fear Street Part 1 is rad. It's great in all the ways the Goosebumps TV show was. Cheesy, youthful, and full of fun, creepy myths and moments, but only now it's all that with a massive movie budget, hugely stylized lighting, some genuine star power, credible performances, and arguably most importantly, a real sense of stake due to the aged up nature of the world and the level of death and violence they're able to get away with. And look, I know this isn't Goosebumps. I know it's not an adaptation of that series. I know that R.L. Stine didn't even write these movies, and that there was a lot changed from his source material anyways, and I know that prescribing any reading of this as being Goosebumps for grown-ups could arguably just be projection on my part brought on from R.L. Stine's loose name attachment. But honestly, it really feels like Goosebumps. It's just that it happens to feel very specifically like the Goosebumps a kid would imagine in his head before he was allowed to watch an episode. I mean, come on. This first feature even takes place in a fully realized mid-90s American suburbia setting. So it's impossible for my brain to not make that connection. And to be honest, the film seems perfectly content with, and arguably even intends on being seen as, a nostalgia-infused work of Americana, so I don't think anyone making it would take offense to this comparison. The film basically reads like a love letter to the slasher movies of the 80s and 90s. It's tropey, but in all the right ways. Set in the suburbs of Shadyside, Ohio, a small town famous only for the absurdly high number of massacres in its history, the film follows the adventures of lead Dina, an angsty teenage girl living with a huge chip on her shoulder after a big breakup, her younger brother Josh, a nerdy, internet-dwelling conspiracy nut, and her two friends Kate and Simon, an overachieving valedictorian cheerleader, and a goofy but surprisingly loyal class clown respectively, who are selling drugs on the side of their curricular activities. After a confrontation with a group from rival town Sunnyvale causes a car accident that spills off the road and into the dark of a mysterious forest, our protagonist and her friends suddenly find themselves seemingly being targeted by a slew of different killers, who all appear to have some ghostly connection to the town's violent past. And it's up to them to not only survive, but work out what has triggered this cavalcade of killers, and how to stop them, all while unraveling the mysteries of their town's terrifying past. The film makes no pretense at being anything that's going to move the needle in terms of how the horror and slasher genres are defined. It wears its influences very clearly on its sleeve. The opening 5-minute bait and switch sequence feels like it's ripped straight from the first Scream film. One of the major antagonists is Friday the 13th's Jason in all but name, even going so far as to look extremely similar to his Part 2 appearance, complete with burlap sack and a resume of murdered campers. There's Evil Dead-esque camera work during the film's forest sequences, and the whole movie's events feel very well treaded and almost Stephen King-esque with the whole small town that houses a dark secret thing it has going for it. It's certainly a film that's done its homework. Its director Leigh Janiak has even worked specifically with some of the intellectual properties it seems to be homaging, having cut her teeth in the genre with a handful of episodes from the surprisingly decent Scream TV series. Fear Street so far with this first film kind of does to the slasher craze of the 80s and 90s what Stranger Things did to 80s Hollywood sci-fi and fantasy blockbusters, creating this pastiche of the period, mixing all the recurring conventions into one blender, and tying the results into a sort of pseudo-remix of those movies, all stitched together with a containing narrative and consistent cool style. You could perhaps even make the argument that it's to the film's detriment, that it isn't so much a new original creation within the slasher genre, but rather just a derivative rehash of its big hitters. But I think to say that is to undersell the genuinely unique qualities the film has going for it. Yes, it no doubt often rests itself on horror tropes made famous by the many movies that precede it, but it, at least in my opinion, still does enough to differentiate itself. The aforementioned goosebumpsy tone gives it a far breezier and cheerier feeling than, say, I don't know, Halloween or Friday the 13th. There's as much high school drama in this thing as there is curses and killing, and it gives the whole thing a nice breezy pace when you're hanging around with actually developed high schoolers with their own lives and issues, instead of just waiting around with stock characters that are really only there to serve as cannon fodder for the gruesome gory whims of the series' chosen murdery monster man. Something I want to point out to as being particularly groundbreaking is the extremely central gay relationship between Dina and her ex Sam. I didn't mention Sam in my earlier synopsis because I wasn't quite ready to deep dive into her and Dina's relationship just then, but make no mistake, this isn't some corporate Disney play-it-safe side character that can technically tick the token representation box, but in a way that any allusion to her can still be edited out to appease other countries' censorship laws. Sam is no small part and basically acts as the secondary protagonist, and her and Dina's romance isn't an afterthought, but is extremely central to the plot and both characters' development. And seriously? How cool is that? Now I know already there'll be someone in the comments saying something like this kind of representation doesn't matter, or that a character being gay doesn't actually change the narrative in any meaningful way and it's just pandering, but like, it really does. For a start, the film is instantly more compelling just with its inclusion, simply by virtue of being different. This perhaps shouldn't feel fresh, but it does. Without diving too much into an incredibly deep topic, let's just say horror hasn't always had the best representation when it comes to the LGBTQIA community. And while a protagonist in a gay relationship isn't completely unheard of in the genre, it rarely comes up in a massively mainstream targeted production such as this. So after sitting through decades of slasher films that prominently feature heterosexual horny teens smashing their genitals together with all of the passion of a Barbie and Ken doll, a straight up unapologetically sapphic protagonist with an actual prominent romantic interest and a plot that absolutely centers that romance as a core focal point of the narrative is genuinely a breath of fresh air. So common, in fact, is the straight romance in these things that the film even cleverly plays with horror audiences' heteronormative expectations, giving Sam a gender-neutral name and never using any language that would gender her up until she's revealed at the closing half of the first act, letting the audience make their own assumptions as to who Sam is up till that point. And I'll bet money a lot more than one person just figured Dina was fawning over a boy who broke her heart before this moment occurs. This is not only just good representation as well, it also proves to be a strong narrative decision. Another reason the romance works so well is because the inherent gayness present in the relationship actually adds stake. Not only do these characters have to contend with their survival, but also the internal struggle of feeling comfortable in their own shoes. This is a small town, and while no outright obvious bigotry occurs on screen, Sam's mother's extreme dislike of Dina and Sam's closeted identity imply more than what's shown. Sam has something to fear in coming out and finds it easier to run away from her feelings for Dina, which is what causes such a strain on the relationship in the first place. And the way the events of the movie develop on these characters, turning Dina from an angsty teen cynic to someone who by the film's climax will cling on to every tiny bit of hope available no matter how small, and Sam from someone who runs away from her problems to someone who faces her fears both of the murderer variety and of the sexuality variety, make it so the romantic developments mirror the horror developments in genuinely meaningful ways, and in ways that a hetero romance, to be quite frank, simply could not pull off. I'm not saying that a romance between a man and woman in a movie can't have stakes or be meaningful, they absolutely can. I'm just saying it can't have these stakes or be meaningful in this way. The satisfying conclusion to their initial relationship before the film sets up for the sequels is cathartic, not in spite of its gayness, or in a way that's indifferent to its gayness, but specifically because of its gayness. And that's fucking rad. It's fucking rad, man. This film is gay, gory goosebumps. I'll say that again. Gay, gory goosebumps. How's that for an elevator pitch? Why the hell is that not the tagline? I'm not saying the film is perfect by any means. It arguably gets too violent at the end, which I know is a really weird criticism for a horror movie, and I'm by no means a prude when it comes to this stuff, but it goes seemingly needlessly cruel for a few brief moments in its final act in a way that feels tonally at odds with what came before. Like, the film is gory throughout, but it goes from, say, Scream level to Saw Trap level, seemingly out of nowhere. Another criticism would be that while some of the characters develop really well, like Sam and Dina, others, like Simon, seem to get to places without, in my opinion, actually going through the development that would get them there. He starts as kind of a dick, almost the jock-like slasher archetype without actually being a jock, only to very suddenly by the film's conclusion become a bit of a sweetheart, without really showing any of the steps in between to get him there. I also have a very weirdly specific complaint about it that I've never really had with a film before, and that's that it features way too much licensed music. There are so many recognizable music tracks in this thing constantly cropping up in sometimes what feels like every 30 seconds that it's actually distracting. I get that they're trying to give every character and the town itself their own soundtracks that communicate something about that person or place, but it's like too much. The songs sometimes don't even have time to breathe and you're already onto the next needle drop before you've even really processed the previous one in what can sometimes be pretty jarring cuts too. It's weird as well because it's not like the music doesn't fit or it's a bad choice in some places. It's all good stuff if you were to say rip a scene or two from the greater context of the movie. It's just that when it changes as frequently as it does here, it can really take you out of the experience for a moment. After all that's said and done though, Fear Street Part 1 is a lot of fun. It's a cool, stylized, nostalgic remix of all your favourite slasher movies, one that doesn't take itself too seriously, has a unique world building gimmick, is wrapped up in a slick looking package, and once again, is gay, gory goosebumps. I'm extremely excited to see what they do with the next two films, and no doubt I'll probably cover them too. So if you enjoyed this video and want to see more, be sure to like, comment and subscribe to my OnlyDans by clicking that red subscribe button below, and make sure to hit the bell to get notifications for future videos. Also, if you'd like to support me and see your own name in these credits now appearing on screen, as well as gain access to a bunch of cool stuff like Q&A videos, original short films, unused scripts and movie pitches, an active private Discord channel, a chance for a video shout out and much more, then check out my Patreon at the link in the description. Currently, there's an offer on where the first 100 patrons get permanent access to all the content put out on higher tiers for as little as $1. So if that sounds like something that'd interest you, check it out. This week I would like to give special thanks to my patrons Joe Moore, Cassie Young, Tim B, and Heath, tell Mike that you like me more than him. Anyway, I've been Dan Drambles. Once again, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you next video.